Max, you are live on the air. Please go ahead with your question.
Awesome. I just want to say thank you, Rabbi, for everything you do. You've been a huge inspiration for me. But the question that I want to ask is, you talk a lot about how the academic consensus on the Old Testament is that it's written by multiple authors, sometimes 100 to 200 years after the supposed events of Christ's life. But then how do you also say that the TaNaCh is the inspired word of God when those same academics turn around and say, well, there are actually 4 authors of the Chumash, and Daniel's written several centuries later, and there's revisions in Deuteronomy? Thank you.
That's a great question.
Before you leave, are you still there, or did you hang up already, Max?
I'm still here, Rabbi.
All right. I just want to make sure I got your question exactly. So I just want to make sure I answer your question. You're asking me, like, the Gospels are written anonymously. Are you contrasting my view of the authorship of the Gospels, lahavdil, to the authorship of TaNaCh? Is that what you mean?
No, God forbid. I'm just asking that, like, how do you reconcile the fact that academics, which you seem to agree with on the Old Testament, say that, or not the Old Testament, the New Testament is written by multiple authors in a later period than what they're ascribed to, whereas those same academics also say similar things about the Old Testament, that it's written by multiple authors in a later period than what it's ascribed to.
Okay. All right. That's a great question.
Thank you, Max. Go ahead and hang up now and tune in for the answer. Thank you.
Yeah. So as it turns out, academic scholars in the New Testament generally agree on the time of authorship of the Gospels, for example, with people who are Christians. It means the vast majority of Christians who are not scholars, who are just Christian, the average parishioner, believe that the book of Mark was written about 70, Luke and Matthew about 85, and Acts a little bit later than that, and the book of John. So I don't think there is a very big difference. 7 of the 13 letters of Paul there's a consensus they were written during the 50s. The only question is the authorship of the 6 other books, letters of Paul, like 2 Thessalonians, like Ephesians, Colossians, and the pastoral epistles. So there isn't consensus. My view is that Ephesians, Colossians certainly were written by Paul. I think it's very likely Second Thessalonians was written by Paul. I think it's unlikely that the pastoral epistles were written by Paul, but it's possible that he co-edited them. So my view actually is, in terms of time and authorship, is very much consistent with what mainstream evangelicals believe. The authorship part is clearly that they insist that Matthew wrote Matthew, and therefore Matthew was written by an eyewitness. So that is a completely spurious claim. Now, if Christians want to say, I believe it on faith that Matthew and John, both of them were disciples, wrote them, and I believe it, they're welcome to believe that, and that's fine. But where Christians get themselves into trouble is when they say that because Matthew was written by Matthew and John written by John, son of Zebedee, Matthew the tax collector, and therefore we have an eyewitness account. That's where they get into trouble, because they're now making a claim, and that's a reason for me to believe that. And if there's no reason to believe that, because those books are written anonymously, that's where they get into a whole bunch of trouble. And Matthew's, for instance, written not only anonymously, but when Matthew's mentioned, he's only mentioned once in Matthew 9:9. He's spoken of in the third person. Now, that would be fine if he's spoken of in the third person, as long as at the end of the book of Matthew, it said something like, and these words were given to Matthew, or Matthew wrote down all these words. Like Matthew 28 ends with the Great Commission, right? So if somewhere there it said, and these words were given to Matthew, fine. Then the third person would just be a literary method, and that's fine, but it's not there. There's nothing like that. In contrast, conversely, lahavdil, the Torah, the authorship, we are told explicitly in Deuteronomy chapter 31, verse 9 and verse 24, that Moses wrote down the whole Torah. He wrote down a scroll for each tribe and one that went into the Ark of the Covenant. Now, why people, and I have friends who are a little silly out there, but they're buddies of mine who do videos on this, and they can't figure that. I don't know why. I don't understand why people don't get that the Torah clearly states the author. It's in the text. Now, you can believe it or not believe it, but the text says it. Conversely, Matthew does not say it was written by Matthew anywhere. There's no reason to believe that Matthew was written by Matthew, and there's very good reason to believe that Irenaeus, a second century church father, he was the bishop of Lyon, which is modern day France, made that up and erroneously based it on a church father, probably on a church father named Papias, a little bit earlier in the second century. There's no reason to believe otherwise. It's the Catholic tradition the Protestants just adopted. And as far as timing goes, well, Isaiah is a problem for those who are not of faith. I mean, the book of Isaiah makes statements that the prophet would not have access to unless he was, in fact, a Navi, a prophet who was receiving divine inspiration. The most famous text is Isaiah 44:28 and 45:1. That's one verse follows the other, which speaks about Cyrus, who lived a little less than 2 centuries after Isaiah. And Isaiah, by name, says that he's going to call the Jewish people to return and build the temple and rebuild Jerusalem. And in fact, that's why Cyrus knows that he's supposed to do that, is because he's mentioned in the book, which is very important. Once you say that Isaiah is written by multiple authors, you're kicking out the legs of history of what compelled Cyrus to tell the Jews go back. Well, he had this book that was not quite 200 years old that named him. So this is why it's very important. Now, the academic world, you don't have to be an agnostic or atheist to be, but the academic world can only use tools that are accessible. And of course, those tools are not accessible with Isaiah. Now, the academic world, frankly, uses methodologies that are not kosher, in that they say that Isaiah 40 through 66 is different than Isaiah 1 through 39. Now, in that 1 through 39 is, a lot of criticism, and 40 through 66 is a lot of comfort. Now, it is true there's a lot of comfort in 40 through 66, and a lot of peroneus is a lot of consternation. There's a lot of criticism, but it doesn't work, because there's a lot of comfort and messianic prophecy in those first 39 chapters. Moreover, they get themselves in all kinds of trouble, because Isaiah in chapter 12 clearly, it's not the only place, speaks about the Neo-Babylonian Empire. So in the very part they want to ascribe to the original Isaiah, contains information about the Neo-Babylonian Empire. So we use the term Babylonian Empire as like the Babylonian Empire that lasted for 7 decades. But there was the real Babylonian Empire was 1,000 years before that. But in the Bible, we're not concerned about that. We're concerned about the Neo-Babylonian. So you get yourself in all kinds of trouble. Moreover, Isaiah is written in a way that is so choppy, it's so incohesive, where it changes from one verse to the next. The whole flavor, the whole sound changes. And that's why I'm teaching the book of Isaiah. But the book of Isaiah is not the book of Judges, is not the book of Joshua. which is very cohesive, is written in a chronological order, is using standard prose. There's virtually no poetry in the book of Joshua. Okay. There's very little poetry in the Torah. There is, but very little of it. Isaiah is all poetry, with the exception of 5 chapters, which means less than 10% of the book. So you can't apply that methodology to the book of Isaiah. And the reason they have to state that Isaiah was written by multiple authors is because if all of Isaiah was written 2,700 years ago during the Assyrian Empire, then it had to be divinely inspired. Because how could someone living during the Assyrian Empire, during the heat of the Assyrian Empire, know anything about the Babylonian Empire and the Persian Empire? That's not possible. You follow? So they're forced, and to say that there's a literary difference is insane. That will be very persuasive to someone taking a course at Yale Divinity School in Old Testament. The student will be very persuaded by that. But people who really know Isaiah will tell you, you could just look it up for yourself, that all Isaiah is doing is swinging back and forth from extreme criticism to sweeping numinous messianic prophecy, and then back again within one verse. Okay, so Isaiah is always doing that. If you don't know that, you're going to be very persuaded by this secular academic world that cannot have all of Isaiah written by Isaiah. One other point, Isaiah did not edit his book during his lifetime because Isaiah was murdered. He was an old man, but typically prophets would gather and edit their work at the end of their lives. Isaiah was murdered by his grandson, Manasseh. He didn't have a chance. So in Chizkiyahu, Hezekiah, his son-in-law, a king who reigned during the time of Isaiah, would go on to edit a number of books in TaNaCh, but germane to us, he edited the book of Isaiah. So you have a later editor. That's why. And when it comes to the book of Daniel, it's because Daniel, even more than Isaiah, contains massive evidence for its authorship during the Babylonian Empire. We have an eyewitness account for Daniel during the Babylonian exile, namely Ezekiel, where Daniel's mentioned 3 times passingly in both chapter 14 and 28. We have an eyewitness account for Daniel as an ancient book during a time when it is said it was written as a pseudepigrapha. I mean, that can't be the case because of First Maccabees 2:55 through 60, where the author of First Maccabees, is written during the time of Hanukkah, during the time of the Seleucid Empire, during the time when the Maccabean army defeated the Antiochus Epiphanes IV. Okay, that's universally, it was originally written in biblical Hebrew. It does not survive in biblical Hebrew. It only survives through the Septuagint, but it was originally written in Hebrew. But it is the absolute consensus. The book of Maccabees was written during that time. And the author is recounting, so you get the context, in times long past when God had delivered the Jewish people and saints of the Jewish people. And among these great deliverances is looking back to when Mishael, Hananiah, and Azariah were delivered from the fiery furnace, when Daniel was delivered from a den of lions in Daniel chapter 6. So we have a mountain of evidence for when the book of Daniel is written. So yeah, I use the same standards. So first of all, for the authorship of Lahavdil, of the Christian Bible, my views are more in line with evangelical Christians than they are with the academic world, because it's the letters of Paul are very interesting. First of all, the letters of Paul state that Paul wrote them. I mean, that doesn't mean it's true, but the letters of Paul, I mean, Hebrews does not say that, Paul wrote it. And very few people today believe that Hebrews was written by Paul. But the 13 letters of Paul, the claim is in the book that this is an epistle, a letter of Paul. Well, that doesn't prove it, but that's contributing evidence. And moreover, it's widely believed that Paul had co-editors. So, and during the first century, Paul's letters were rewritten, edited, stitched together. Second Corinthians is not one letter, it's really multiple letters that was sewn together. I mean, this is consensus stuff, right? We have in Romans 16, where we have Tertius openly, we are told in the book, co-wrote the book. So I don't know why people I'm so my views about the time of the authorship of the majority of the New Testament books is much more in line with conservative Christians than it is with the academic world. My dating for the most important books, and I date Hebrews at about 64, which is absolute consensus. I date the Gospels between 70 and 95, which is right down the middle. The only thing is I believe that the evidence against the Pauline authorship of Ephesians, Colossians, Second Thessalonians, I think is too thin. And it's very easy to explain why these letters would be using different language, different words, a different lexicon than other books, because there were people who went over the book and edited, and therefore you find those differences. But the evidence for Pauline authorship is very, very strong, in my view. And there are many New Testament scholars that agree with me and many who don't. That's why the 7 letters of Paul are called the indisputed. There's a reason why the term is indisputed, because virtually no one disputes that Romans and Galatians, the first and second Corinthians, were written by Paul. I mean, it's not like no one. There are people who think only 4 of them were. There are, but those are outliers. So no, I look at them, One other point I think I should make, and that is Christians get into trouble because they make claims about eyewitness, that the New Testament eyewitness account. If they don't do that, and just say, look, it's an article of faith, that's fine. I mean, for me, it's an article of faith that the first 24 chapters of First Samuel were written or co-written by the prophet Samuel. I can't prove it. Clearly, from 1 Samuel 25 on, the prophet Samuel couldn't have written it because he died. So it's really simple. But I don't say you should believe in Samuel because Samuel wrote it, or you should believe in Joshua because Joshua wrote it, because that's silly. But what's my evidence? It's just an article of faith. I would never use it as an apologetic. And that's where Christians get in trouble. Why? Because they're bad, because they're evil? No, because this is what they hear from preachers and apologists and just presume it's true and regurgitate it when it's not correct. So my views are very much in line with what most evangelical Christians believe about the dating of most of the New Testament books, not authorship. There's no way in the world that I believe that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were authors of the books that bear that name. Anyways, thank you so much for your thoughtful question.
If you enjoy this channel and the content, and it has changed your life, or perhaps the life of a loved one or a close friend, would you please consider supporting this work? You can click this link and it'll take you directly to my website with the donate button. Or there's a Patreon link and a mailing address for snail mail if you would prefer. If you do donate, please do me a favor and leave me a phone number where I can contact you and thank you properly. I hope you all have a wonderful 2025. Shalom.
All right, let's move on in to our next